Start.
Yeah.
So, hello everybody. Thanks for asking me to do Journal Club. Although I think we're going to recall it Journal Camp because no one actually enjoys Journal Club. It's quite a difficult thing to do. The paper that I've been given is quite an interesting paper because it's not stuff that, so as part of our training in emergency medicine, we have to do a critical appraisal exam, and so we like practice doing therapeutic papers, diagnostic papers, systematic reviews and stuff like that. And this is kind of doesn't really fit into any. It's almost as if it's using life-saving interventions as a diagnostic tool for major trauma. So that's kind of how I've approached this and interpreted it using the CASP worksheets. So I don't know if any of you know Jamie. No. So Jamie was a medical student at King's when I was an SHO. And it's amazing to see all the stuff that he's actually managed to do since then. He's done a lot of work on major incidents and major incident triage. And he's one of the defence medical trainees down in Plymouth, I think he is. He's won a lot of prizes, research prizes, ARChem, and he's presented a lot of his stuff. So we'll talk through the paper and the appraisal, and I'll welcome people.
I'm very well, mate. Very well.
Does anyone know who this is?
Sure.
Tom?
No, I'm not that old.
Yeah.
It's related. I'll give you a hint. It's related to the paper.
Okay. Right.
She's American.
Okay. Yeah.
This is Professor Baker.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Does that give anyone any clues?
Send some pictures.
No. So she invented the Injury Severity Score.
Yeah. Basically, the one that we've got.
And she's still alive. Basically, so this paper talks about whether or not the ISS is a good predictor of major trauma. It's difficult because the ISS is something that we do retrospectively. It's based on imaging findings, it's based on operative findings, or it's based on pathological findings. It's not something that we do pre-hospitally, although for those of us who are used to doing PCS shifts, it's something that we do provisionally to calculate how injured someone is when we do PCS. And the reasons it's relevant, one of our seminal papers is the major trauma outcome study, and this was a kind of a precursor to TARN. But as you all know, the injury severity score isn't a great thing to establish whether or not someone is injured or not. And Mike, do you remember why?
Yeah, I can do that. I'll have
Sorry, I'm distracted by Chris in the background.
Sorry. So why is the major trauma outcome study not good? And why is the ISS not good?
Well, it doesn't necessarily correlate with as you said, actually patients who require life-saving interventions, and and in particular, major trauma outcome study is the challenge with that across the UK. Well, there's a few different issues. One is the populations that were included, I think, weren't actually well distributed in all different areas, representing different sites and sizes of sites. I can't remember the other things, but. And
the other thing is that it focuses a lot on blunt trauma. Claire's here now.
Where's your camera?
I don't know. It focuses on blunt trauma, and it actually focuses on vehicles. So it was a thing used by insurance companies to calculate injury mechanisms and that. So it's not really relevant to necessarily some of the stuff that we go and see. So falls from height, interpersonal violence, so that kind of thing. So that's a little bit of a background about the ISS and how it's applied. And the reason that it applies to us is because we use the ISS in the UK to identify how much money is given to major trauma centres. So major trauma for us is designated as someone with an ISS of greater than 15. And we get money for that as an MTC. And you also get money for anyone with an ISS of greater than 9 as well. So there's the 9 to 15 and the above 15. And that's what funds the money, and that's the tariff, the major trauma tram that gets given. So we'll start. Does the study address a clearly focused issue? I've said yes. So in terms of the population study, this is the kind of population that we deal with as a pre-hospital service. The population is a valid population. It's a major trauma population. I've said already, it's not really a diagnostic or a therapeutic paper per se. And it's not something we really think about in terms of life-saving interventions that we do. So that's what I've said. It's important because, as we know, trauma is the third leading cause of mortality in the UK. So annually, that's 3,000 deaths, and it leads to 8,000 disabilities as well. And it led to 2012, the reconfiguration of trauma in the UK and the creation of major trauma centres and paediatric major trauma centres. And again, that's how funding happened as well, and that's where the major trauma tariff comes from. I've said major trauma is identified as those with an ISS of greater than 15, and also money also comes with people who have an ISS of greater than that. The authors of this paper wanted to change the definition of major trauma as a patient that required that resource-based criteria, so those who required an intervention. So they've said a life-saving intervention. Requiring a life-saving intervention is someone who has major trauma, and we're going to discuss how they've come to those in a second. So one example of a life-saving intervention is a blood transfusion. So for these guys, it's the transfusion of uncross-matched blood or more than 4 units of blood products. I don't know, Mike, did you send around the life-saving interventions supplementary appendix? Or is it just
no, I just sent that to you, I think. I didn't send it to you.
It's interesting because some of the stuff is obviously what we think of as life-saving interventions. So intubation for airway obstruction, a thoracotomy, but there's also things like a laparotomy, an IO needle insertion, administration of seizure terminating medication. So things that we may not necessarily think that we use as necessarily life-saving. And an IO, for example, might just be someone who is an IVTU or someone that we can't get vascular access in, and that counts as a life-saving intervention. Next question is, was the cohort recruited in an acceptable way? So, Anna, what do you think about TARN and recruitment? Populations.
I think it's not always hugely reliable because we don't always get 100% of data through. And the other thing that I sort of noticed was that some of these, I think it went back to 2006. So that data is now 14 years old, which is quite a long time to be bringing forward and using to make decisions for nowadays, because things have changed quite a lot. So that was my 2 sort of comments on the methods.
Yeah. It's a very defined population that we're looking at. TARN is probably the best thing that we have in the UK for identifying those patients who have major trauma, but there's a number of things that it doesn't include. So anyone who is PLE'd at scene is not included at TARN, and they will obviously be those who have will definitely have an ISS of greater than 15. And even then, they may, in terms of life-saving interventions, they will have either a lot of life-saving interventions, or we PLE them at scene and we don't actually do a lot. It's important to know that not all major trauma centres in the UK participate in TARN, and also secondary transfers from non-participating hospitals aren't included as well. So there's a small number of people who are included.
Matt, can I just say something? There's another very important thing about TARN, which you might be coming on to say, which is how you get selected to go in the first place, even if you're in a centre that's participating and your data collection is good. Do you want to say?
Yeah, so basically TARN is very reliant on who inputs the data. There's a lot of things that TARN doesn't include simple neck of femurs, but that's not to say whether or not a young person sustained a neck of femur injury from a high impact RTC, just all neck of femurs, closed distal limb injuries, it doesn't include as well. And there's certain exclusion criteria. And like Tom said, the data that gets put into TARN is dependent on those who put data in. So if, for example, you work at Chelsea and Westminster, when I was an SHO, the ED registrars put in the TARN data and submitted to TARN, whereas at RLH here, we have dedicated people who put in the TARN data, and you have to be, you know how hard it is when we have to put in the provisional injury severity score on the for our PCS shifts, and you have to rely on someone being able to interpret the AIS based on either the CT report or the operative findings. The surgeon or the radiologist has to specifically say things that fit in, otherwise they are coded as not further specified. So that's a little bit of the nuances around the TARN data as well. Is that kind of what you meant, Tom?
No, well, that's all relevant, and you're correct. But if you work on the basis that the data entry is done well, there is still an important caveat, which is that to get considered to go into TARN in any way, shape, or form, you have to either be admitted for more than 3 days, admitted to critical care, die, or get a damage control procedure. So if you come in with a tension pneumothorax peri-arrest and get a chest pain, and then you're well and discharged, or you take your own discharge before 72 hours, you're not TARN eligible. So particularly in a system where you have a lot of penetrating trauma, and our patients sometimes get well quite quickly and then, wish to no longer be in the hospital. Quite a few of those patients are. So there's some important things about how you even become TARN
eligible.
Even before your ISS is calculated.
Okay.
And I suppose in our hospital, we have such a specialised trauma ward in 12D that actually quite a lot of people escape going to critical care because they can be managed well on 12D. So that's even more important, because then they may just have a short stay, but be the sort of person that would normally be admitted to a HD or a ITU in another hospital.
Yeah, you're right. So the population, they looked at a population between 2006 and 2014. So during this period, the MTCs came into being. They looked at 193,000 patients. They gave some brief things that were mainly male, median age is 60 years. And the most common things were fall of less than 2 meters. Was the exposure accurately measured to minimize bias? So if you say that the exposure is a life-saving intervention, I've said you can't really tell. And the reason I've said that is because a life-saving intervention is a subjective thing. If you look at how they decided what counted as a life-saving intervention, they used what's called a modified Delphi process. If you read what they did, it was actually the modified Delphi was for life-saving interventions in a major incident. So it may not be the same thing as a life-saving intervention for a normal major trauma patient. The other thing is the list of life-saving interventions aren't validated, but all the subjects were actually exposed to the list of life-saving interventions. There's certain things like a Russell chest seal counts as a life-saving intervention, and a tourniquet counts. And the number of times that we have gone up to a patient and they didn't need a tourniquet, or they didn't need a Russell chest seal, kind of makes me think that it is quite subjective in this case.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of issues you've raised there, Matt, that they need to be teased out a little bit because some of them are slightly different. So
yeah,
there's one difference about, do you agree with what they identified as the list of life-saving interventions and the meaning of that? And that comes later more in terms of interpretation of the study rather than is there bias. I think what's different than whether you agree whether these things are life-saving measures or not is what you had just said about the subjective nature of it. And that's true for not even things like Russell chest seal, but even if you look at on a day-to-day basis who we RSI, you can go to a D&D and have a discussion around, like just last week's D&D, would you RSI this patient? Wouldn't you RSI this patient? And that is very different between different people. So, and I think also in different systems, you can see how that would be different, and in different types of hospitals, those exposures may be different to whether or not, especially if that's what's causing the person to be categorized as their outcome measure. So I think there's a great deal of subjectivity that is introduced into using this type of measure, but there are other benefits that, that against the sort of the TARN type of approach that we can talk about a little bit later.
And so there was my cartoon that I found about what happens at a Delphi process. So what they did is they sent out a questionnaire and they had a big list of life-saving interventions, and they asked some experts from the UK and South Africa to see what they thought was a life-saving intervention. Then it goes round in another 2 iterations before they finally decide what counts. And it's interesting how the Delphi process is used in this way, because it is definitely probably one of the more subjective methods of a consensus agreement as opposed to anything objective. Have the authors identified all important confounding factors? So they actually go into what they think are confounders. They talk about the patient's age. The other thing was they included the subgroup of those who had an ISS of greater than 16 as well, and they performed the analysis with those. So I've said they have, that's a yes from them. I don't think they've missed anything important, unless Mike, you could find any.
No, I think there weren't any specific confounding factors other than the things that we talked about a little bit earlier around population and potentially some of the factors that come in terms of not all sites participating, and is there a greater likelihood of sites that are major trauma centers participating than the trauma units and things, and that could have a bit of an impact, but I think you've addressed those already.
And then the question 6 is, are the follow-up of subjects complete enough or long enough? I think that you can't really tell. I don't think it really applies in this. They're not really lost follow-up because they've got all the data. So what were the results? Okay, I can't believe you gave me a paper with so much stats in it that I don't really understand. So bottom line, I think the answer is that the probability of receiving a life-saving intervention, can't even spell, increases with ISS. Is that what everyone got? Yeah. And I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into these results. The greater number of life-saving interventions that a patient received, the greater the 30-day mortality. That's a fairly linear kind of result there. However, a low ISS does not mean that life-saving interventions are not needed. Like Tom was saying, if someone comes in with a tension pneumothorax and they get a tube thoracostomy, that we would all agree that that's a life-saving intervention. So it doesn't really capture those with a low ISS.
I guess,
yeah.
Matt, the question is though, is whether, because remember they're sort of comparing kind of the sensitivity of this alternative to ISS. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because you're sort of using ISS as the gold standard when you phrase it like that.
True. But there isn't really like the ISS is being used as a gold standard here because it's what the comparator is. But we know that we've already identified what the flaws are. And similarly, I was talking to, I can't remember who it was, who was saying, you know, some of the patients that we miss in HEMS have a low ISS. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't need life-saving interventions.
Right. I think that's the point that that they're trying to make, and as opposed to using ISS as the gold standard, it's more comparative to see where they correlate and where they don't correlate.
Yeah. How precise are the results? So this is me trying to interpret stats last night. So anyone want to tell me what Spearman's correlation is?
I like Spearman's rank. With the same bloke, different test.
I think it's the same bloke, different test. Anyone?
Don't make me Google.
Don't Google. No one's putting their hands up. Right, okay, so this is what I think is Spearman's correlation. Okay, so if you have a Spearman's coefficient of 0, there is no relationship between both of the variables. If your Spearman's coefficient is 1, there is an explicit absolute relationship between the variables. If your Spearman's coefficient is -1, there is an inverse relationship between the variables. So what does that mean in this study? Between 0 and 1, there's a variable within that. So if you have a coefficient of greater than 0.7, it's very strong. Between 0.4 and 0.69, it's strong. This study fits within the 0.3 and the 0.3. So there is a moderate association between having a life-saving intervention and a high ISS. And the closer you get to 0, then it's weak and negligible. That is what my interpretation of the Spearman's coefficient is. So, do we believe the results, guys? Anna?
So I think the other question that's a little bit more interesting is not just the correlation with the ISS, but the correlation with mortality.
Yeah.
The other thing they reported, because that, just trying to find it in the paper.
It was 0.91.
Yeah. Which was a much better correlation. And I don't think they actually told us what the correlation was between the ISS and mortality in this group here. To be able to compare the two.
So the other thing that I found odd, so if you look at the results section, it says a clinically significant number of cases, 5.3 and 7.6, received a life-saving intervention despite having an ISS of less than 8 or less than 15. I can't find where they get this 7.6% from, because in the table, it's 8.8%. And I wonder if there's a typo in their paper.
It wouldn't be the first time.
And I did the maths. So if you divide 7,848 into 89,129, it is 8.8%, not 7.6%. Anyway, if anyone can find the 7.6% that they're doing, because it's in the abstract.
Should email your friend.
Okay, so that's whether or not we believe the results. It's not that great an effect, and they have eliminated from the confounders here.
The 7.6% I see, though, it says for adults.
Yeah, but it is an adult population.
Under 20 years to
Yeah, I can't find it.
I wonder if it's a subgroup.
Yeah.
They just reported them differently in the two tables.
So will the results help locally? I've said we already know. I think we already know as an organisation that a life-saving intervention, the life-saving interventions that we do, don't necessarily indicate a relative to a high ISS score. And I think we don't really work with ISS that much. I think the major trauma centres do, and that's where the money is follows. But I'm not sure it will necessarily help our day-to-day practice. It probably informs, if, you know, for example, the case behind having a Medic 3 team, and if LAS are saying that the ISS scores, would the patients that we're missing have low ISS scores, that we can tell them that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't need a life-saving intervention from an additional critical care team. That's how I interpreted it. Do the results of this study fit with the other evidence available? Yes. So there's two groups of people who have done work on this before. There's Baxt and Uppinix, and they found there was a lack of correlation between ISS and life-saving interventions, and they've got fewer life-saving interventions. And there was another person called, someone beginning with P, Palmer, who found the same things, but I think this is the first time they've found it in a UK population. The other thing I want to say, there's not much data on at the moment. So we use the LAS, or LAS use the major trauma triage tool, and as part of the NICE major trauma guidelines that came out a few years ago, one of the recommendations was that none of these trauma tools have been validated. There's a certain number of anatomical and physiological features that help ambulance crews triage to places, but we know as a service, LAA, we don't use that trauma triage tool, and that's the benefit of having senior clinical decision makers. We can bypass those tools because we see these patients, we know they need a major trauma center, even though they don't necessarily fit within the trauma triage tool. So what are the implications of this study for practice? I think this is more of an issue for trauma networks and trauma centers rather than ourselves as a service. I've already talked about that if you want to use it as a case for a Medic 3. I think there are some trauma triage tools that miss patients, and is whether or not you accept a resource intervention as a way of identifying whether someone needs a major trauma center, but it's probably a bit retrospective. This kind of gives people the power and the discretion to deviate from a trauma tool, but I think we already do that as a service anyway, is what I've said as a HEMS team. I think that's it. That's the last one. It's a hard paper to appraise.
Actually, it was in some ways kind of a nice softball paper to appraise. Thanks, Matt. That was really good. And actually, as Tom mentioned, appreciate your detective work. Always doing sort of back of the envelope stats when you read a paper is very helpful to find these things. You can often either find sometimes errors or miscommunications in terms of tables versus what they report in the data. I had a couple of points, but I'll let see if Tom or Anna or anybody else wants to jump in first. So the three things that I thought of when I thought of this paper, and I agree with you. I think this is an issue for major trauma centers. When I see a paper like this, I think of two things that jump to mind. One is people who are saying they want more money and they want to influence the funding criteria because they feel that hospitals are not getting appropriately funded based upon the current formula because it's based upon ISS and they're looking for money, which is one thing. The second thing I think comes, and they do talk about this in the paper about the triage scores, as you mentioned, the trauma triage tools, and that across the rest of the UK, so all these scores and tools are based upon ISS. And if you're missing patients that, that have low ISS that still require life-saving interventions, are you really appropriately targeting the pathway of care for these patients, or are they ending up in places or not having appropriate teams sent to them, and patients could potentially be suffering from it? So that's the other part. And the thing that I would disagree with is that it's not an issue for us, in that it's not an issue for us at the moment, because we don't link to TARN data. And eventually, and hopefully in the not too distant future, when we have NHS numbers and things like that, and we have the potential to make those connections with TARN, you can bet that someone's quickly going to look at us and say, so why are you responding to all these patients with low ISS? Is the service required? Is it valid? Is it valid? Why do we invest all this money and effort in critical care teams across the UK that go to patients that have low ISS and based upon these criteria, shouldn't even be going to a major trauma center, let alone having a doctor sent to them on scene. And that's only a matter of time, I think, before that starts to happen for us, as well as more broadly across the UK. So I think this is actually a hugely helpful piece of work that have been done now to start to help people understand better. And I think it's also the setup for a future better tool, which takes both aspects into account. Because clearly retrospective stuff, which is hugely, I think, open to issues around particularly radiology descriptions, which differ based upon, being in a major trauma center with a radiologist who may be much more used to reading scans and putting the right stuff in versus not. Like, my old job, I've dealt with hospital systems where the hospital system that I was working at was not doing well in terms of our standardized mortality, but it was purely down to documentation. Well, there's some other quality issues in the organization that we're also working on, but a huge chunk of it was fixed just by fixing documentation. So these scores you can really impact by things like that. So there's variability in them, but also because they're all retrospective, it makes it less helpful to help develop prospective triage tools. So anyway, so that was my sort of take on the article. I know, Tom, you're the one that suggested it, so you must have some thoughts on it.
Vested interest.
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts were similar to yours, Mike, in the sense of we go round and around the ISS loop quite a lot. And, I was asked this question very recently, looking at the sort of second team or the extra team idea about whether these patients we miss, what's their ISS? And you're a bit like, well, A, we don't know, and B, it's not very relevant. So I thought the paper was helpful from that point of view. I think it is interesting to think about the sort of background work to this, and I was one of the participants in the Delphi study around what constitutes a life-saving intervention in the context of a major incident. And to be fair, they've taken that work, and the question was in the context of a major incident, and applied it here. I'm not saying that's totally inappropriate, but it's maybe a bit different. So I thought that was interesting and worth bringing that work to wider attention. And I think there is something about trying to develop better ways of capturing the sort of interventions required and the value added for advanced pre-hospital care. And I guess there's other stuff to think about, isn't there? The previously used revised trauma score, the RTS, which is a sort of weighted score of GCS, blood pressure and respiratory rate, which kind of was popular for a while and then fell out of favour, but does also correlate very well with mortality and is prospectively, or I wouldn't say prospectively, but is measured in real time based on physiological data at the scene and doesn't require a scanner. So yeah, I just thought it was an interesting topic to talk around in terms of how do we know which patients we should be going to that we make a difference to or not. And like you, I've met and collaborated with Jamie on a couple of occasions over the years. He was an elective medical student when I was a HEMS registrar. So again, I thought it was useful to give his work some attention, because I think he's
done a lot.
And I think is increasingly, as an academic emergency physician, starting to put out some quite good stuff. So yeah, those were my rationales for suggesting the paper.
I think also we've been talking recently as a consultant group about whether it's worth making everybody calculate the provisional injury severity scores every day on every single patient for the rapid review. I think that probably does emphasise that it doesn't have massive importance, but probably what is more important, and it was suggested at the meeting, that everybody understands the TARN process and how it's collated and things, and so probably replacing the daily calculations with a session with the TARN people at RLH within the induction period is probably the way forward, rather than, I don't know, Matt, what you feel about that, and is Claire still there?
They've gone to rapid review.
Have they? Fine.
And it might be something that's worth putting out to everyone, yeah.
Right. Well, thanks a lot, Matt. And I forgot to mention in the beginning, we recorded this, and so for others who couldn't make it, if nobody has any objections, we'll share it internally for people to view. They've actually been getting a fair number of views, each of them, the last 20 each, so which is a good chunk of the team. So that's great.
When's the next one?
The next one will be the last week of September.
How do I view them, Mike? Where are they?
So I sent around the YouTube links. I can send them around again. I put them on the WhatsApp group, the HEMS WhatsApp group, and they were in the newsletter last month. But,
okay.
I'll send them to you.
Sorry. Thanks. It's good. It's the first time I've been able to come, but I'd like to catch up with some of the retrospective ones. It's really good.
Yeah, the one that Claire did on, I think it was Claire, on assessment of chest stabbings, I thought was actually quite interesting and relevant to our group.
Brilliant. Thanks all.
Thanks.
Right. Take care. Bye.